All right, back live tonight on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. Political parties have long vied for the support of the coloured and black population, which forms one of the largest demographic groups in the Western Cape. The Institution of Justice and Reconciliation says it could play a pivotal role in shaping the region's electoral outcome. Some believe that beneath the surface of the Rainbow Nation lies a history marred by the scars of racial division and inequality, giving rise to the complex relationship between race and politics. Well, we are getting into that conversation now, and I am joined in studio by political analyst Tessa, Patriotic Alliance Head of Strategy Charles Cilliers, and ANC Member of Parliament Cameron Dugmore, as well as DA Gauteng Deputy Chairperson Pogiso Mthimunye. You can join us also tonight in the conversation. Why does race continue to play such a salient role in our politics as opposed to the non-racial consensus that we aspire to in the Constitution? Is it because of the past? Is it because of the 1994 settlement? Or is it just the fragility of black and white, coloured and Indian South Africans? What are your thoughts? You can weigh in tonight. 072-110-5584. You can drop us an X tonight at Newzroom 405. Before I give to the parties, Tessa, let me begin with you as an independent analyst who has observed the politics of the country for a while. When you look at the campaigning that has been happening to the build-up to these elections, are political parties confronting the challenging issue of race and identity?
Well, I do think race and identity still has a role in the way that political parties are formulating their strategies. I don't think that anyone, even if they say they're colorblind, thinks of race as inconsequential yet in our South African landscape. And I think there's two ways in which it matters. The first is just the geography of the country. And so if you're looking community by community, even voting district by voting district, because spatial apartheid still has its tentacles in our vista, you're still going to have concentrations of racial categories of people and people of different ethnicities in the same kinds of areas. And so that in itself will play into some racial thinking on the side of parties. But I also think what's happened, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, is that our politics has become a lot more localized, and people are trying to find similarities outside of the big political ideologies. And so, again, we're starting to see people retreat into lagers, and some of those lagers are religious, but some of those lagers are racialized. And those racial tensions that we haven't dealt with historically are starting to play up again in politics. So it's not off the minds of political parties that they need to be sensitive to race at this point.
Yeah. Cameron, there are some who would like to think the reason why we are still seeing race 30 years on into democracy is that as much as the ANC would like to say that South Africa has improved since 1994, the democracy of 1994 has become a form of neo-apartheid, where only a small black elite and middle class has been admitted into the order of white economy prosperity and white privilege, while the majority of the population remains poor, and black in particular, and black in the broadest term that, by the way, we use in South Africa.
No, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and greetings to the other guests. I think it's important that we begin this debate with a clear understanding of what are the events that actually led up to us developing, crafting, and adopting a democratic constitution, because clearly the legacy of both apartheid and colonialism were very, very central to the resistance against apartheid, the liberation of our country, and eventually the setting up of our constitution, which is very clear about the vision for our country, which is a united one, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and very importantly, prosperous. But the constitution very clearly says that central to building a democratic and a non-racial South Africa is the issue of redress, because of what was legally a crime against humanity as declared by the United Nations. There were millions and millions of South Africans who suffered unfair discrimination. So it was only correct that the progressive ANC governments after 1994 began to introduce measures, as the Constitution actually requires, to redress those imbalances. But I would disagree completely with the notion that this has led to a black elite. If you look at the transformative policies, for instance, let's take the primary school nutrition program. Let's take access to higher education. The criteria there, let's use NSFAS. Any family, whether previously classified as African, colored, Indian, or white, whose income is less than 350,000 Rand, and obviously with their marks at matric allowing that access, is able to get a bursary. So that's clear that the empowerment clearly affected the majority of disadvantaged, but it did not exclude white South Africans, for example, who earned less than 350,000 Rand. So the key issue here is that the ANC and the country have gone through a journey, striving for non-racial prosperity, but being very firm that the redress measures required because of brutalization, colonialism, exploitation, economic exploitation are still with us. And one can see, you can track progress in regard to land restitution, in regard to education, housing. And anyone who today says that South Africa is not a better place for the majority is clearly not being honest. We know that a lot more needs to be done, but the reality is the redress policies, we would argue, and the evidence shows, have benefited historically disadvantaged communities, but more needs to be done. 650,000 mainly black workers, African and colored, actually have share ownership. So it's not only the issue of a wage, it's also equity in businesses. And that's just some of the examples.
But Pogiso, let's bring you in here as Cameron speaks of redress measures, right? It appears to many, and certainly it's been debated with the Democratic Alliance, that you appear to be challenging these race-based institutionalized government initiatives for redress. And that is blamed as a reason why there is, of course, this race consciousness, especially when it comes to these issues. And the discourse of race blindness that comes from the DA, it's seemingly not gaining traction. People are saying you're just merely camouflaging discrimination.
So, not at all, not at all. And I think it's just to latch on what Cameron had said. To be honest, poor South Africans and black South Africans are not a lot better off than they were in 1994. In fact, in some cases, we have regressed, and you get anecdotal evidence when people tell you that life was better in homelands. And I don't want to go into that, but you get that in generations before, telling you that there were certain things that were much better. We have some of the worst education in the world. We have some of the worst health systems in the world, and we have and our youth unemployment is the highest in the world. If we're taking care of mainly poor young black people, none of these things would be a reality to start with. So in fact, where we are with race-based policies, so our review as the DA on the race-based policies is based on exactly what you say, that they have created an elite. And we must be honest, this elite has been an ANC elite, and we see it especially in the public procurement space. And we see it also in spaces where the ANC has artificially created connected elites that have become billionaires, and the majority of black people have stayed behind. And you can see that in the big indicators, not the small ones that are being picked just to create a story of successful BEE. If BEE was successful, we wouldn't be here with the worst education, the highest unemployment, and some of the worst health systems. Now, our position is, with a country as poor as it is, or poor people being so many in this country, you don't even need a proxy for poverty. So black does not need to be a proxy for poverty. The majority of the people in this country are poor, and they are black people. Deal with poverty as a whole in the country. When you improve education as a whole in the country, then the majority of the black people will benefit. and we will still improve race relations in the country. We're not going to pick winners and losers. We understand that underdevelopment markers are mostly pronounced in the Black population as the majority of the population. There's clear understanding on that, and no one is denying that. But we're saying you deal with the core of the problem. You lift the majority of people out of poverty, including Black people, without creating the legislation that has been abused by the elites that are mostly close to Cameron's party. And we can mention them by name if you need to go to that tab.
All right, let's take a break. We'll come back. And Charles, we'll give you a chance to weigh in. And we'll open up to you as well, the viewers at home, 072-110-5584. Why does race still play such a noticeable role in our politics in the country? Is it the past? Is it the 1994 settlement? Or is this the fragility of Black and white communities in South Africa? You can weigh in tonight. We'll continue in a moment. Back live with you tonight here on In Focus for more on the race issue in our politics. Joined in studio by Tessa Dooms, Patriotic Alliance's Head of Strategy, Charles Cilliers, ANC Member of Parliament, Cameron Dugmore, and DA Gauteng Chairperson, that is Pogiso Mthimunye. And your views, of course, welcome tonight, 072-110-5584. Charles, let's bring you in here. Where do you sit in this racial consensus conversation and around the question of the premise of a non-racial South Africa significantly having not improved the lives of a majority of South Africans?
Thabo, I think that's the question for South Africa and for our time, because South Africa is disfigured by race because of apartheid. We have to be honest about these things. You can't run away from it. And anybody that's going to come with some kind of notion that you can't have to tackle race head on is going to miss the point. Right, because it's the preoccupation of many people in this country. And yes, it's been 30 years since apartheid ended. And as the PA, we argue that there was a choice at the end of apartheid to truly defeat apartheid. And the only way you truly defeat apartheid is if you move away from these labels of race that define your society, that define how you structure your society. And the people at the time decided, no, we have to hang on to these labels because we have to use them because they're a useful proxy for so many things. So we decided to hang on to these labels, right? But then they got rid of the last three numbers on the ID book, which told you what race you are. But everything about you and everything about the society still tells you that your life is defined by your race in so many ways, right? So we may as well have hung onto those numbers. So in some ways, we haven't defeated apartheid, and we'll only defeat it the day that you are a South African first and foremost. And that's what we as the PA are promoting. We're saying we can't keep kicking this can down the road. We need to deal with the race question now for the sake of our kids, because our children can't keep getting born into this disfigured society where race determines so much about you. It's not right. We can all agree on that.
And what is the way that you're suggesting that should be done?
So obviously we can't run away from the fact that we've got a lot of work to do. So as the PA, we are saying that we're not going to support the current form of BEE, for example, because we feel it's failed, right? And I heard what Cameron said earlier. I mean, there's a lot of things that Cameron said we can agree with, but the problem with BEE is that it has created an elite. And of course, there's a lot more that people have benefited from the change in society, but there is that problem of the elite. And there was that co-option. And there was that, you can call it a moral licensing by big business to bring people to the table and say, oh, you know, we'll give a handful of people big stakes and everything and say, oh, you see, it's better now because there's black people at the table, right? But that hasn't really changed the reality for many people, and that elite is an issue. So we're saying as the PA, we need to do away with the current approach, and you need something more like an empowerment fund that will fund and provide capital to an emerging class of young people who have entrepreneurial ideas, who want to do businesses, and you boost that and you find a way to grow the economy and grow small businesses at the same time as actually including people more in the economy. So that's our suggestion, but of course, this is a dialogue, it's a dialogue of ideas, it's a marketplace of ideas, and that's what we're bringing.
All right. Tessa, I mean, has this discourse been helpful of DA is a vehicle for whiteness, ANC is a vehicle for black? Has it helped anyone, really, the approach that we're taking to this?
Well, I think holding on to the categories, as Charles says, has a value, right? And the value for me is to signal whether or not those categories still hold weight and whether they still signify the things that they used to signify. So people have asked me, do I think we should do away with the categories? Only until we get to do away with the categories when we've done the work to change what those categories mean or to undo their meaning that they had in the past. And I don't think we've done that work. Right, so I think with those categories have meaning, and the ways in which it expresses itself in politics is about power struggles. Because that's what those categories have come to mean. Some people have more power than others. Some people have more access than others.
But DSS don't need a proxy for that. You don't need to get, because when you say poverty, we know that it predominantly means black people, and they will definitely be the beneficiaries if you deal with poverty.
But we're not only talking about economics here. We're not only talking about economic access or even poverty. We're also talking about the ways in which people operate in society, are treated in society, their humanity and dignity is accorded to them in society. So let's just go back to the example I used earlier around spatial planning, for example. If you don't think about spatial planning through the lenses of the ways in which apartheid set it up, then you won't undo it. And apartheid set it up by race. We haven't undone spatial apartheid. We live with spatial apartheid today because we're not thinking about how do you create integrated communities that take people outside of these residential areas, not even residential areas, housing reserves that aren't meant for anything else but for people to be far away from economic activity and far away from each other. If you don't undo that with the lens of race on, then you can't undo what race means and what blackness means or coloredness means. So you have to do more than just say, poverty or spatial inequality. You have to name it so that you know what you're undoing, right? But I also think that political parties have leaned into these things in weird ways. The ANC is an example of that. To talk about black in general and African in particular is a weird way to lean into race. Because you're also not telling me why you have made that distinction. What is that distinction about? What is it going to accomplish in society? And again, I think that it's been about, signaling to communities that you are trying to reach out to them, but not necessarily doing it in practice, in practical ways for practical reasons and practical outcomes. We've done a lot of talk to pander to particular racial groups. So, even in the PA's case, not black enough, not white enough, and that kind of rhetoric, and it just panders to the community as a voting bloc, but not necessarily in ways that I think undo the structural elements of our society that apartheid gave us.
Yeah. What is it? African in general, black in particular, one of the things that don't make sense. Another one that was even debated in the ANC policy conference and other conferences, white monopoly capital. Cameron, some of the things that how you're leaning into race that really don't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Look, I think there's just a few things that need to be said here. I agree with what Tessa is saying, that, to simply say we're hanging on to labels actually reflects a complete lack of understanding of how race, class, and gender have impacted on the deep inequalities, racism, and patriarchy in our society. So it's not an issue of hanging into labels. Now, it's very funny that the DA comes here and wants to talk about an elite. This is a party that has voted against employment equity, which has actually helped to create a black middle class. I mean, when the ANC took over, there was not a single black DG, not one. And employment equity in the public and to an extent in the private sector has clearly built a broad black middle class. We've moved on the issue of black industrialists, and that includes African, colored, and Indian. And what is wrong with actually building access to assets and wealth by people who historically were removed from where they were operating their business? So the reality is that the DA opposes land redistribution. They oppose the NHI, which is going to assist the majority of poor and black people in this country. Yeah. They actually oppose something such as the minimum wage. Yeah. The DA does not want a minimum wage, which mainly impacts on colored and African domestic workers and farm workers. But you see, it goes actually deep, and I'm going to come to the issue of terminology around African and black. But you know what? The issue of race is also important, not just in this campaign, but in the culture of our organizations. Here we have a representative of the DA who knows in his heart of hearts that when a DA member who is black does something wrong, they get treated differently to white members in the DA. We've got countless examples of white DA councillors who presented their CVs fraudulently. They were protected, whereas others were actually dealt with. We've got the whole issue of what happened to Mmusi Maimane. The hatchet job that the DA did on him was from a committee set up, Ryan Kutsia, Tony Leon, and one of the big DA funders who was white. They were the ones who actually found that Mmusi must go. Then you have Cilliers' comments about colored people not being qualified enough to take positions. You have her comments on colonialism. So in his own party, and you have Cilliers who describes Panyaza Lusufi's crime wardens as, being recruited from a shebeen and wearing pep stores. That deep-seated racism is alive and well in the DA. It's absolutely there. And that is why you've asked the question for this program, whether race matters. So why the DA is beginning to lose support across the board is because not just their policies are against redress, but their internal operation shows clear racism. In our legislature, I'll give you one example. We have a deputy speaker called Bev Schaefer. She was found by a legal commission of inquiry to have abused 155,000 Rand for misuse of a car 3 years ago. They've kicked that to touch. They haven't dealt with it. She still hasn't paid the money. The Auditor General is asking questions, but she, as a white DA deputy speaker, is being defended. So the DA is both internally racist and their policies actually go against redress. We are proud of the fact that 650,000 workers in this country are now shareholders in their companies.
All right.
So the reality is race is an issue because the DA is deeply racist.
Right.
They
Cameron,
are deeply anti-transformation, and
it
that's
there.
why they're being deserted.
Hold it there. Let's get DA to respond. Now, Pogiso, I want you to respond to that, Cameron, citing a number of instances that, I suppose, in a sense, echo what Tessa was saying, that if you don't label and if you don't define, it becomes problematic in how you deal with the various instances that could have been mentioned of what is happening in the DA. If you use a blanket thing to say, well, there is no proxy for poverty or there is no proxy for gender equality. If you say this, it means everybody.
So, yes, I'm going to address that, and I'm shocked that Cameron is turning this into a DA-ANC debate. Let me quickly deal with that. It's you know, when you are a government for 30 years and you've not solved people's problems, you're going to look for some opposition party to blame while you've had power for 30 years. And you've really not delivered. There are more, the proportion of people who are unemployed as a proportion, as a percentage of the population is higher from the early 30s in the 90s to the early 40s now. That is a failure. That is a proportionally, life has gotten worse for the majority of black people in this country under that ANC government. No government has stolen as much from its black majority people as the ANC government. So you cannot have people that have been in government have actually really destroyed this country of majority black people to come here and do virtual signaling about a few issues here. People talk about issue of Muslim Imani. Actually, more leaders have left the ANC than any other party. They fired 2 presidents here, and we've never said a race thing. So these things happen in politics. So let's come to the real thing, and let's leave a party that has destroyed this country. Why the issue of race? We say South Africa first is a majority black country. There's no doubt about that. And the majority of the failures of the state affect black people. Yeah. We are saying go to the core and solve the problem. Solve an economic problem through economic growth. Do land reform. We support. In fact, the most successful land reform cases are in the Western Cape. Cameron can tell you that. Where the least failed handed over farms are in the Western Cape. Cameron can tell you that. The city manager in Cape Town is a black person. The city manager where I live, in the council that I'm in, is a colored male in the city of Tshwane. There is no such a thing. So what's happening here is that people are looking for an excuses for their failures when they've not solved the core problem. If you solve the core problem of South Africa, which is basically unemployment, poor education, and a lack of development and a lack of good health services, you would have solved the problems for the majority of black people in this country and everyone else, and you would lift them out of poverty, and then you will decrease inequality. Yeah. You would make access to the economy better for them. And we say also scrap BEE, link to the UN development goals. What are the UN development goals? If you link public procurement to the UN development goals, you will have private companies helping eradicate hunger, helping with quality education, helping decrease inequality, and you reward those with more points on public procurement. So take out the BEE billionaire and look and work with companies that are here to help you solve the South African problem. There's a fundamental South African problem that, yes, affects the majority of black people and disproportionately. So that we admit, but you solve the South African problem, you solve the problem for the majority of black people, and not do this race merchant thing that people that have delivered nothing have done over the years. Our track record is solid in terms of that, and in terms of empowering all races and pushing diversity within our structures and in government where we are.
Back live tonight, my guest still with us, and the conversation continues. Let's take a look at some of your views that have come through on 072-110-5584. Anonymous saying, hi Tabo, I think the issue of racial divisions in our country is still rife, and the ANC is not helping by implementing policies that favor one group over the other. BEE, for example. Another one from Anonymous. The politics of South Africa in nature are race-based. White conservative parties have to get buy-in from either blacks or colored. Hence, majority of their manifestos focuses on the conditions of black communities. Hence, they sell them pie in the sky. But the reality is that the white majority will never vote for black-led political parties, regardless of how best they may perform. Are you selling pie in the sky, Charles, to colored voters who are voting for the Patriotic Alliance?
So, Tabo, so many things come to mind during this discussion, right? And I think the journey of the PA is a good lesson in how maybe the country can transform. Because everybody knows that the PA started as a predominantly coloured party. We never said we're a coloured party. We always said we're a non-racial party, and we want to put a place at the table for the coloured voter, who we identified, which I'd say correctly, was just being excluded from the debate. And that we were saying, no, we're willing to at least put issues for the coloured voter at the top of the agenda and fight for it unashamedly. And that was the position of the PA for many, many years. And then as we evolved, we realized that we can transform from being a coloured party to being a colourful party. And today we are very proudly colourful, and we have white support, we have black support, and we're actively wooing that support, right? But we continue to stay true to our roots, because we can't abandon the coloured people, because we still feel that those issues must have a voice. And anyone joining the PA understands that that voice is important, right? But I mean, as a country, I knew we were losing the plot many years ago when I opened the Sunday Times and there was an article there about the Gupta family calling themselves black. And I thought, but they came from India, these people. And of course, Indian South Africans do qualify as black, but at that time there were what, 1.2, 1.3 billion people in India. And are we going to say they're all black, you know, if they all happen to come to South Africa? So I feel like we're losing some of the plot here in South Africa because we're squabbling amongst ourselves as South Africans, and the PA is saying we need to be patriotic as South Africans because we're losing a lot through this squabbling. You've got a lot of white people that could have stayed, and whatever you might say about their politics, they could have stayed and they could have helped to build the country, but they've emigrated, they've taken money, they've taken skills with them. And you've got a lot of illegal foreigners who are migrating, crossing the border illegally and coming here and they're working, and they're taking jobs from South Africans. And there's a lot of people on the ground who don't have much. They don't have government services, they don't have jobs, and we have youth unemployment now at 60, 70%. And they're struggling to get into jobs. And I was in Cape Town, and I was shocked. I was there 2 weeks ago, and I actually walked away there going, is there a boycott against employing South Africans? Because everywhere you go, you don't really find South Africans working in restaurants, driving taxis, working in security. And we're all squabbling with each other about which race in South Africa should be benefiting. Meanwhile, there's people coming here that are not even South African, and they're benefiting. And we're saying we need a bit of a reset as South Africans and get back together and focus on what actually brings us together as South Africans. We focus on those similarities. You know, I mean, the Springboks made it famous, right? But there is some truth to that stronger together idea.
They say we can all celebrate the Springbok, but it doesn't give us socioeconomic advantage. It's not a primary marker that we are all now equally successful, Tessa.
Yeah, I think what we're missing in this conversation as well is that race isn't biology, it's power, right? It's power imbalances and oppression of one group by another or groups by each other on the basis of justifying through biology. So race is not a real thing, but it is real in the sense that power imbalances exist in our society. And we know that there's historical evidence that black communities have had to come together and find a voice in order to push back against white supremacy. Now, those things are real and they have real import and real impact. And I say this because of what Charles just said now. When we're talking about coming together as South Africans, we must realize not all South Africans are coming together on the same footing. That's the point. And so when we start talking particularly about black foreign nationals coming into the country, these are also people who are vulnerable, also people who are oppressed, also people who are black, also people who have the same kind of historical disadvantages. And then they're coming into a system where they're not going to be treated the same way that white foreign nationals are treated, right? That in itself talks to the fact that we have to look at race and the role that it plays in disempowering some people and empowering others. And so when you just say everybody's the same and we're just going to treat everything like we're on equal footing, we are missing the historical context and the lived experiences, the lived realities that people have. The other part of it is also social capital. So you could say, well, you know, the economy is open to anyone. Anyone could go in and on merit go and be hired. In a country where the majority of people and the majority of money and capital is in the hands of white communities and white people, social capital plays a role there.
So you're saying if we don't deal with the dominance of a particular race in the economy in a meaningful way, we leave
In
it to chance
society.
for it to happen. Say it's an open
Right.
market. Let's all go and
The same
compete.
thing happens with men's dominance and patriarchy. If you build a society with one group of people in mind, and everybody else is now having to find their way to fight into that system, fight into that way of life, fight into being accepted in there, then you're always going to have a power imbalance. And this country was created with whiteness in mind, with the benefit that white people have historically coming into the society. You can't wish that away. You have to systemically change that. You don't just change power imbalances by saying everybody's equal, when in fact, in real terms, we are not. And the kinds of social ways that we interact with each other are still showing up, that we will exclude each other unless we are forced to. Stronger together only happens on Rugby Day. The rest of the time, we live very different lives in this country.
Yeah. Cameron, let me bring you in here that there are those who say the ANC, and this is not the DA, by the way, it's other parties that say the NCS can say they want to give black people economic advantage. But the problem of the ANC is that they will never give black people economic advantage because they are concocted into white monopoly capital. They've signed this deal with the elite, and they are maintaining their economic dominance over the black African majority.
I think that is a perspective that used to be pushed by people who set up a faction within the ANC calling themselves RET. You might notice, and your DA speaker referred to people leaving the ANC. Yeah, people have left the ANC. People who used a British propaganda agency called Bell Pottinger to invent this term and have left the organization. And that is linked to the process of renewal in the ANC. So the reality is that construct was created in an attempt to divide and factionalize the ANC. But the fact that those elements are now out of the ANC is actually strengthening the ANC's commitment to those key principles and values. And we'll be the first to admit that along the way, there have been those particular issues. And I also think it's important to say, in this debate that, race, the construct of race, I think Tessa's 100% on, because it is about power. If you look at the key fundamental contradictions in our society, they remain the issue of gender oppression, the issue of race, and the issue of class.
Right.
So that is why redress is still important. But, your colleague, not your colleague, but the speaker from the DA, he talks about the Western Cape. I want to give facts that come from the provincial government's own PERO, the Provincial Economic Review, that over the last 5 years, and this is why it comes to the issue of who do you govern for in terms of racial terms. Do you know that white employment in the Western Cape grew 23% over the last 5 years? This comes from PERO. African employment reduced by 11%, colored employment reduced by 9%. So in reality, what you're having is that for every white job created in the Western Cape over the last 5 years, 2 black jobs have been lost. That's from their own PERO report compiled by academics from Stellenbosch University. So the DA in the Western Cape has had 15 years, and in that 15 years, there has not been the setting up of a house for the Khoi, San, and traditional leaders. The only province that hasn't recognized indigenous people. People define themselves as Khoi and San, as Nguni, as Xhosa, as white, as Portuguese. The definitions that people use, that's a question of identity and how people identify themselves. But the reality is that race has been used to oppress people economically and socially. And the ANC is very, very proud of the fact that we will continue. I mean, Charles there talks about foreign nationals. You know what's strange to me? His leader, Gauteng, goes over and is received by Zionists in Israel. Gauteng is very happy to have Zionists come over and treated in a certain way. And also, this notion that if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic is absolute nonsense. And also then has got a particular issue. We agree you have to have immigration control, and you've got a big problem in Cape Town. That's where I agree with Charles, where the DA is not at all worried about foreign nationals being employed illegally because they get paid less and they're exploited more. Look at the George tragedy, a prime example of a construction mafia in Cape Town employing vulnerable foreign nationals. But then at the same time, you have this rabid anti-xenophobia language of the PA. And I'll also use the example, where in Saldanha, there's a young child, a young colored child who went missing. And Charles's leader went about basically fueling racial tensions, trying to basically say that this child who was colored was used by witch doctors, in inverted commas, which were obviously from the African community. So Charles mustn't come here and talk about this so-called better together, non-racial, where he's his own leader, sparks and sentiments between African and colored people, sparking division, and then also very dangerously having this rabid xenophobia, which can be described in no other way, to try and then, win votes and secure votes here. And that's very, very dangerous. So our position basically is that the DA governs for the elite in terms of the race and class and economic power. That's why you see the regression in black education in the Western Cape. The facts, when we governed the Western Cape, we were the #1 matric. Right now, the DA is #5. They've dropped all the way down. Why? Because they've neglected Manenberg. They've neglected Khayelitsha. They've neglected the rural areas. There are more bachelor passes coming from Limpopo than there are in the Western Cape. So in 15 years, they've entrenched.
Let's wrap it up, Cameron. I'm out of time. Yeah, let's wrap it up. Let's give Pogiso then a final thought to share on that one. And Charles, you'll wrap it up for us here in the studio.
Yeah, thank you. Now I see why people are rejecting the ANC and why they're looking for parties with real solution. I've never seen so much scapegoating by a party that's the national government. I mean, scapegoat about education, scapegoat about illegal immigration, things that people are responsible for, and they look for others to blame. That's the problem we've had over the last 30 years. We've had leaders that have looked for things to blame rather than themselves, and rather than sorting the problems out. I'm saying to South Africans, where we govern better. We have a project in City of Sano called Townlands Tabu, which is the largest public housing project in the country. The majority of beneficiaries are black people, and we didn't even have race as a factor on it. And people are paying 800 rand for social housing. These are people that with very little income, what the so-called missing middle.
That was started by the ANC, and you want to claim...
must judge parties.
You want to claim what the ANC has done.
We've been in government for 8 years in Swansea. It can't be an ANC. South Africans must judge parties for what they deliver, not what they say. Not sending people like Cameron to do smoke screens here and not be genuine about what they've delivered. To speak about education when they call learners at grade 10, to learners that they think won't make it in matric, they call them at grade 10. These learners drop out, and he wants to come here and tell us about education. These type of leaders that we've had in this country need to change, because these are people that are not genuine about leading this country. Let's solve education problems. Let's solve poverty problems. Black people, the majority, will benefit. We don't have to racialize it such that the friends of people like Cameron, elites, people that fund Cameron, even Saudis of the world, and all of these other people that have a close tie to the ANC, benefited billions delivering nothing to these people, to our people, in the names of black people in South Africa. So let our people get solutions that are impactful, that are direct, that will solve the problems that they face for everyone, and in particular the most vulnerable, which are the black people.
All right, out of time. I'm going to leave it there. Charles?
Just as a closing shot, when we started the PA, we said in our founding document that if you look at the ANC and you look at the DA, neither of them are really bringing the full solution. And you need a third alternative to come through. And I think looking at the debate that we've had tonight, it's very clear that that hasn't changed. And that's why the PA is here, because neither of those parties are going to come with the full solution. And with the PA at the table, I think we're going to see change.
Let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Thank you all for coming through tonight. Tessa Dooms and Charles Cilliers, as well as Cameron Dugmore and Pogiso Mthimunye for the Democratic Alliance. And thank you as well tonight for sharing your thoughts with. Back on In Focus tonight, and thanks for staying on. Quick reminder that all our conversations, of course, are also going on X as well as on WhatsApp. So when we have them, you certainly can send us your comments and your views. We'll put them up for you. Here's what you've had to say to the conversation on race politics. Renelo is saying, please remind DA that it has started to place black leaders to gain black voters. And then they realize that they are still losing with those black votes and losing white votes for Freedom Front Plus, and they changed to use white leaders to replace blacks. Only in Gauteng, that is where they used black provincial candidates. Evening, Taba. I think to address the issue of racial groups in South Africa and the needs of people in different racial groups, we need a political party that is inclusive of all people from different racial groups, especially at the executive level. At least DA is trying, even though I feel that it prioritizes the needs of white people over others. Look at the state of Mamelodi in Tshwane. But it is better in terms of racial inclusivity. Appreciate your messages and your comments tonight, and we'll do it again at the same time tomorrow with our conversations going on.